So the Viewpoints elicitation technique. So this technique, it's fairly self-explanatory. It's eliciting requirements through different viewpoints. So there are three generic types of viewpoints that can be used. You have the interactor viewpoints, the indirect viewpoints, and the domain viewpoints. And I'm going to go into each one of those a little bit later, so I'm not really going to delve too much into what those are. But the interactor viewpoints is basically the user. The indirect viewpoints would be somebody like the manager or the developers, someone who is not specifically going to be using the product, but still has a say and a buy-in to the product. And then the domain viewpoints would be outside constrictions, such as standards that need to be included in the product, but don't necessarily mean a person, if that makes any sense. So an example would be an ATM. So you have an ATM at a bank. You have the interactor viewpoint, which would be the customer who is coming to the ATM to withdraw money. Now, some of their requirements would be simplicity. The ATM has to be simple. It can't be complicated for them to come and pull out money. And then accessibility. Their money has to be there. It has to be accessible for them to gain. That's a requirement that they need. The indirect viewpoint would be that of the bank manager, who he doesn't, I guess you could use the ATM, but he's not, the ATM is not for him. He would have different viewpoints on the requirements, such as security. He's concerned with, is the money in the bank or in the ATM going to get stolen? He might also have further concerns, such as the authenticating and recording of users. I mean, he wants to be able to know if anything is stolen from the bank. He wants to know who did it, who is accessing, yeah, however you say that word. Who was getting into the ATM at that time, so we can catch whoever it was. And domain viewpoints on an ATM would be something similar to bank-to-bank standards. When if you're transferring money from one bank to another, what are the requirements for that? And those would be, once again, they would be security, authentication, just those kinds of things. Now the pros of using the viewpoints method is complicated interactions, such as those required by bank standards, which we mentioned for the ATMs. They can be somewhat simplified by looking at how the requirements change, moving to a different perspective. And requirements can be classified when they've been given by different stakeholders, and that can make it a little bit easier to grasp the whole concept of how the requirements are all fitting together when they're all classified and you can see them, how they interact with each other. And finally, the viewpoints method, it recognizes that different viewpoints exist, and it gives you a way of making a summary of those, making it so you understand how everything fits together, kind of like the previous pro, being able to classify requirements. Now the cons, non-functional requirements, such as requirements that aren't really required or I'm sorry, that aren't part of the function of the product, they can be difficult to figure out using the viewpoint technique. The viewpoint technique can become expensive, using man hours, different resources. It can just become fairly expensive to keep doing. The more viewpoints you get, the more expensive it becomes. And also, it can be kind of rigid. I mean, when you're looking at it from one viewpoint, there's only so many requirements you can get to before you run out. It's just too rigid. Or it can be too rigid, rather. So the recommendation for when to use the viewpoints elicitation technique would be when the project or when the requirements become fairly complex or interactive, such as for that of an ATM at a bank. Also, when there is a number of stakeholders that have buy-in and you're trying to quickly grasp all of the requirements that these stakeholders want, you can use viewpoints to say, okay, if I'm looking at it from this stakeholder, what are the requirements that he wants? And then you can move to the next one and do the same thing. Also, if conflicts were to arise, say among stakeholders or even among the requirements engineers, during the elicitation process, then the viewpoint technique can be used to say, okay, let's just take a step back and let's take a look at from this stakeholder's point of view. What are the requirements here? And you can classify them as you go down. You classify all the requirements for all the stakeholders, for all the requirements engineers, and then you can have a firmer grasp on the big picture and see how things are really working together. Now, as for the data for the actual project that we are working on in this class, from the interactor's point of view, the end user, if you will, they're looking at ease of access. The calendar app, it has to be easy to use. If it's too difficult, why download it? There's no point. The events, they would want to be easy to look at, easy to change, to edit. If you're looking at different meetings, different events that are happening on campus, they're going to want to be easy to join, etc. There's different eases of access that need to be able to happen, or it's not going to be something users are going to want to use. Also, presentation. If you get an app and it's not pleasing to look at, the chances of you keeping it around aren't all that high. So the more pleasing the interface is, the more likely the user is to keep it. But the interface, it still has to be workable. If it's pleasing to look at but you can't use anything, that really means nothing. Now, the viewpoints of the indirect user, such as for, say, the school. Now, the school, they have events that are private. There are only certain people invited to these events. There's also such things as advising appointments. They're confidential appointments between the student and the advisor, and they're private. I mean, it says in the slides here they have their private natures. So the indirect user is wanting confidentiality. That is one of the requirements for the indirect user. The second one is security. It's basically the same thing as the confidentiality. The user accounts, they have to be protected against data theft, so the confidentiality requirement isn't compromised in addition. Now, domain constrictions, such as standards for security for inter-device communication, this again, it goes back to security. The devices would be communicating with each other if you have a bunch of students who have joined the same meeting and they're they have chat features going on and they're talking to each other. When these devices are talking to each other, an attacker could use that connection to attack somebody else's device or any devices connected to a meeting per se. Also, the domain constrictions, the domain viewpoint would be concerned about privacy. The notifications that come through to the user on their phones or on their tablets, it can't be too intrusive. There has to be a way for them to control that. If there's not a way for them to control that and the notifications are just going off everywhere, there is a very low chance that the users will be keeping that app around.